that. Boom. Look at her put her knee into Caitlin Clark's groin right there on that play, right? I mean, this is gross right there.
Like, can we get Caitlin Clark a little protection out?
I watched them all the time. I think I watched Indiana State and Iowa. Caitlin Clark play about the same last year, so I was watching a lot of basketball.
When one of basketball's greatest minds finally speaks up about something he witnesses, the entire sport stops and listens. That's exactly what happened when Larry Bird watched a moment unfold on a WNBA court that he couldn't stay silent about. This isn't just another controversy or heated debate that will fade away in a week. Bird's analysis cuts to the heart of what women's basketball is becoming, and his message is directing the entire league toward a critical decision point. What started as one hard foul between two players has evolved into something much bigger, a conversation about standards, integrity, and whether the league is willing to protect the talent that's driving unprecedented growth. The basketball world has been shaken by his response, and once you understand why Bird felt compelled to speak, you'll see why this moment matters for the future of the entire sport. This is the story of how one legend's perspective could change everything. There was a game that shouldn't have been remarkable. Just another matchup between two WNBA teams competing for wins. But what happened during that Phoenix Mercury game became the catalyst for one of the most consequential statements a basketball legend has made in years. Larry Bird, someone who spent decades not a natural part of competitive basketball, but a deliberate movement that seemed designed to cause discomfort rather than affect the actual play. If that weren't enough, Thomas followed it up with a hard shove from behind while Clark was already compromised, already dealing with the aftermath of the initial contact. This wasn't some debatable judgment call. The footage was clear. The intent seemed apparent. And Bird, watching this unfold, felt something that most casual observers might have missed. He wasn't just seeing a hard foul. He was seeing something that violated his understanding of what competitive basketball should look like. What made this moment significant enough for Bird to speak wasn't simply the physicality itself. Basketball has always been physical. The NBA's 1980s, Bird's era, was notoriously rough. Players tested each other constantly. They'd leave bruises. They'd exchange words. But there was a fundamental difference between that kind of competition and what Bird witnessed Thomas doing to Clark. The timing was everything. To herself or engage in actual competitive play. She was dealing with one issue when another came from a direction she couldn't see. That's the distinct life around the game at its highest level. He's faced Dennis Rodman, one of basketball's most infamous defenders. He's gone up against Bill Laimbeer, another player known for physical play that crossed lines. He's been elbowed, grabbed, and tested by some of the toughest competitors to ever step on a court. So when he speaks about the difference between competitive fire and cowardice, he's not speaking from theory. He's speaking from experience. What Bird saw in Thomas's actions wasn't the kind of toughness he respected. It wasn't the kind of competition that built champions. It was something that left a sour taste because it represented a shortcut, a way to affect an opponent not through skill or effort, but through a cheap shot when the opponent couldn't respond. The footage circulated. People debated it online. Some defended Thomas, arguing that hard fouls are part of the game. Others condemned her actions immediately. But most observers were waiting for someone with real credibility to weigh in. Someone who'd earned the right to speak about what authentic basketball competition looks like. That's when Bird decided to speak. And his response wasn't measured or diplomatic. He called it the most cowardly act I've seen on a basketball court in decades. Those weren't the words of someone offering a casual observation essence of the game he loved. This moment mattered because it wasn't about one player's feelings being hurt. It was about something Bird believed was fundamentally ball itself. When Larry Bird speaks about basketball, people listen. Not because he's famous, though he certainly is. Not because he won championships, though he won 3. People listen because Bird level. His playing career wasn't just successful, it was historically significant. Bird played in an era known for its physical intensity. The 1980s NBA was a different beast than what we see today. There were fewer rules protecting players. Officials called fewer fouls. The philosophy was that if you wanted to play professional basketball, you had to be tough enough to handle it. Bird didn't just survive in that environment, he thrived in it. But here's what's important about Bird's perspective. He didn't thrive despite the physicality. He understood it. He knew how to navigate it. He knew the difference between a defender who was trying to make your life difficult through legitimate competitive means and a player who was just trying to hurt you. And critically, he knew how to respond to both. When someone tested him physically, Bird found ways to punish them on the scoreboard. He'd hit a three-pointer in their face. He'd embarrass them with his basketball IQ. He'd make them regret the decision to play dirty because his skill level was simply too high. This experience matters when evaluating his current perspective on Caitlin Clark and Alyssa Thomas. Bird isn't some analyst commenting from the comfort of a broadcast booth without real experience. He's someone who's actually been in the arena. He's actually faced the toughest defenders and the most physical opponents in basketball history. So casual critics. He acknowledged that his era was the most suggesting that modern basketball should return to those days. He was simply contextualizing what he experienced. In his time, yes, players were tested physically. But, and this is crucial, there was a code to it. If you had a problem with someone, you confronted them directly. You didn't wait until they were looking away. You didn't target them when they were vulnerable or unprepared to engage. Distinction is what Bird emphasized when discussing Thomas's actions against Clark. Bird played alongside and against some of the greatest defenders ever. He faced Karl Malone at his peak. He battled Dominique Wilkins. He went up against Magic Johnson in some of the most intense playoff moments basketball has ever produced. In every single one of those matchups, there was mutual respect combined with absolute competitive fire. The physicality was real, but it was also honest. Both players knew what was coming. Both players had the opportunity to respond or get out of the way. What Bird witnessed Thomas doing to Clark violated that fundamental principle. It wasn't honest competition. It was a deliberate attempt to inflict discomfort on someone who couldn't see it coming and couldn't engage in actual physical competition to respond. This credibility matters at the absolute highest level of professional basketball. What happens after a controversial moment often reveals more than the moment itself. How a player responds to criticism, how they handle being called out for their actions. These things tell you a lot about their character. And Alyssa Thomas's response to the fallout from her play against Caitlin Clark told Bird everything he needed to know about what he was really witnessing. Thomas didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge that her action had crossed a line. She didn't take responsibility for what she'd done. Instead, she did something that Bird found particularly frustrating. She positioned herself as the victim. She suggested that the criticism she was receiving was unfair, that people were ganging up on her, that she was being treated unjustly for simply playing hard defense. "Damned if I do, damned if I don't," she said, essentially arguing that no matter what she did, she'd be criticized anyway. It's a narrative that places her in the position of someone being wronged, someone facing an impossible standard, someone who can't catch a break. This response is where Bird's analysis becomes really cutting, because he's seen this before. He knows what it looks like when a player is deflecting, when they're refusing to accept responsibility for their own actions, when they're playing the victim instead of owning what they did, and their actions on legitimate grounds. But deflection, victimhood, that's not something Bird respects from elite athletes. What Thomas's response revealed to Bird was something deeper than just one controversial play. It suggested a pattern of thinking. When you can't compete at the level you need to compete at, when your skills aren't quite sufficient to match the opposition, when you find yourself losing or struggling, what do? Some players work harder. Some players get smarter. Some players develop new aspects of their game, but some players do something different. They find ways to affect the game outside of basketball skill. They look for shortcuts. They engage in physical plays that push boundaries. And when they're called out for it, instead of accepting responsibility, they play victim. They suggest the rules are unfair, or the criticism is unwarranted, or they're being targeted unfairly. This is what frustrated Bird most about Thomas's response. Not just the play itself, but what the response suggested about her approach to the game. It suggested that instead of accepting responsibility, instead of acknowledging that she'd done something inappropriate, she was doubling down on a mentality that allowed her to feel justified in her actions. Bird made a pointed observation about this. Players who truly belong at the highest level of competition, players who have the skill and the character to be champions, they handle criticism differently and they learn from it. They don't make excuses. The fact that Thomas responded the way she did suggested to Bird that this wasn't an isolated incident born of one heated moment. It suggested a pattern. It suggested that Thomas had developed a mindset where she felt justified in these kinds of plays, believe she'd done anything wrong. That's a fundamental problem, because it means the behavior is likely to continue. It means Thomas hasn't learned anything from the incident. It means she'll recognized it for what it was, a defense mechanism, compete at the highest level on skill alone. And that realization made his criticism of Thomas even sharper, because it wasn't just about one play anymore. It was about a pattern of behavior and a mentality that Bird found troubling. Here's where Bird's criticism shifts into something much bigger than one player or one incident. When he spoke about Alyssa Thomas and the play against Caitlin Clark, he wasn't really focused on protecting Clark's feelings or even punishing Thomas. He was concerned about something far more systemic, the integrity of basketball itself, and what message the league was sending by allowing these kinds of actions to continue. Bird made a crucial observation that many casual fans might have missed. If the WNBA permits players to target superstars without meaningful consequences, if the league allows players like Thomas to engage in these kinds of plays and then deflect responsibility, what message does that send? It sends a message that if you're not talented enough to compete fairly, you can resort to other methods. You can survive in the league not through skill development or basketball IQ, but through physical intimidation and predatory plays. That's a dangerous precedent. That's not something you want becoming normalized in any sport. Because once you allow that to happen, once you establish that as an acceptable way to compete, you start to corrupt the entire competitive structure of the league. Think about what that means for young players watching at home. What are they learning that are just barely over the line? It's to test the officials' tolerance. Bird was emphatic about this. He said young players shouldn't be getting their basketball education from watching the WNBA if what they see is playing. The league's failure to adequately penalize these behaviors was, in Bird's view, a failure to protect its own product. Because ultimately, the ways it attracts new fans is through exciting, talented players like Caitlin Clark. When those players are being targeted and the league doesn't respond meaningfully, the league is essentially devaluing its own stars. But it's deeper than that. It's about setting standards. Every league has standards. The NBA has standards about what constitutes flagrant fouls, about what kind of physicality crosses the line, about what happens when you intentionally hurt another player. The WNBA should have equally clear standards, and those standards should be enforced consistently. What Bird saw was a league that wasn't enforcing its standards effectively. A league where a player could engage in a clearly inappropriate play, and then when called out, could essentially dismiss the criticism and face minimal consequences. That's not how you maintain competitive integrity. That's how you send a message that the rules don't really matter, that it's okay to target other players as long as you can justify it to yourself. Bird's concern was that this would proliferate. If Thomas got away with it, if the league's response was weak or insufficient, then other players would see that and get the message. They'd understand that there's a limit to what they can do, but that limit isn't as clearly defined as it should be. They'd see that big stars are vulnerable to targeting and that the consequences aren't severe enough to deter that behavior. The integrity of basketball is built on the foundation that the best team and the best players win. It's built on skill, effort, basketball IQ, and competitive fire. When you introduce a variable that rewards dirty play or allows players to target opponents with impunity, you undermine that foundation. Bird wasn't being sentimental or nostalgic when he expressed these concerns. He was making a practical observation about how leagues maintain their competitive integrity. You have to have standards, you have to enforce them, and you have to be especially vigilant about protecting your best players because they're the ones drawing fans, building your league's reputation, and showing the world what your sport is capable of. Before we go any further into Bird's analysis, it's important to understand something about Caitlin Clark's situation. She's not dealing with what Bird dealt with in his rookie season. She's not facing the kind of challenges that most young superstars encounter. She's in a completely unique position, and that makes everything about her situation more complicated and, frankly, more unfair. Clark is 22 years old. Let that sink in. She's dealing with this level of representation of women's basketball as a whole. There are people who are watching to see if women's basketball can succeed at a mainstream level, and they've attached that question directly to Caitlin Clark. Add to that the physical reality of being targeted. Clark isn't just trying to become a great WNBA player while dealing with intense media scrutiny. She's also dealing with opponents who are testing her physically, who are making plays designed to intimidate her or distract her or hurt her. She's having to constantly look over her shoulder, literally and figuratively. Bird's point was that this combination is genuinely difficult. A player could handle the media attention. A player could handle the physical play. But handling both simultaneously while trying to perform at the NBA, she's not just trying to build her career. She's simultaneously trying to prove that women's basketball itself is worthy of mainstream attention. That's a burden that most young players never have to carry. What's particularly unfair about Clark's situation is that while she's dealing with all of that, she's also the primary target for physical play. If players are looking for a superstar to test, if they're looking for someone to see if they can rattle through intimidation, that superstar in this moment is Caitlin Clark. So she's facing the worst of both worlds. She's got the maximum attention and the maximum physical targeting. Bird was pointing out that this isn't just about fairness in one game or one moment. This is about whether the league is going to protect the player who's most responsible for its growth and success. Because if Clark's experience in the WNBA becomes one where she's constantly dealing with these kinds of plays, where she's constantly being targeted, where the league isn't protecting her effectively, what message does that send? It sends a message to other young, talented women watching that this is what it means to be a superstar at the highest level. Players can't escape this kind of treatment, her peers. But there's a reality about her basketball career. She's not at Clark's level. She's not the most talented player on the court. She's not the one drawing attention and commanding respect purely through her basketball skill. When a player finds themselves in that position, when they're competing against someone significantly more talented, they have choices to make. Some players embrace their role. They understand where they fit within the competitive hierarchy, and they maximize their value in that context. They become excellent defenders. They become great team players. They find their niche and they excel in it. Other players struggle with that reality. They want to be the star. They want to be the most dominant force on the court, but their talent level doesn't quite match their ambitions, so they look for other ways to affect the game. They look for ways to compensate for the gap in skill. Bird's analysis suggested that Thomas falls into that second category. She can't beat Clark through superior basketball skill. She doesn't have better court vision. She doesn't have a better shot. She doesn't have the same basketball IQ. So instead of accepting that reality and maximizing her role in a different way, she's compensating through physical play. This is a pattern that exists throughout sports. It's not unique to Thomas or the WNBA. You see players do this all the time. When they can't win through skill, they try to win through intimidation. When they can't embarrass an opponent on the scoreboard, they try to embarrass them physically. It's a shortcut, and it reveals a fundamental insecurity about one's own basketball abilities. What troubled Bird most was that if the league allows this pattern to continue, if it doesn't adequately penalize players who resort to these tactics, then it's essentially incentivizing mediocrity. It's saying to every player in the league who has questions about whether they can compete at the highest level through skill alone, don't worry, you can just target the best players physically. That's an acceptable way to compete. That's a devastating message to send, because it means the league is no longer primarily selecting for basketball talent and excellence. It's selecting for players who are willing to play dirty, who are comfortable using physical intimidation, who are okay with not competing on equal terms. Consequences that change behavior, but here's where it gets interesting. Because Caitlin Clark's own response to all of this tells you something important about her character and her mindset. She hasn't spent time complaining about the physical play. She hasn't made excuses about the tough treatment. She simply continued to show up and compete at the highest level. That resilience is remarkable for a 22-year-old. Most young players, facing this level of physical targeting combined with intense media scrutiny, might struggle to maintain focus. They might let it affect their performance. They might become defensive or bitter about their situation. Clark has done none of that. She's continued to perform at an elite level. She's continued to show the basketball skill that made her special in the first place. She's letting her game do the talking rather than getting caught up in drama and controversy. That response has only increased the respect people have for her. Fans see a young player handling adversity with grace and competence. They see someone who's focused on basketball rather than personal grievances. They see someone who belongs at the highest the values basketball should represent. The broader question isn't just whether the WNBA will listen to Bird. It's whether the basketball community as a whole is going to stand up and say that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable. Will analysts and commentators continue to criticize Thomas's play and whether other veteran players will call out this kind of behavior? When superstars and respected figures speak up about competitive standards, it matters. When the basketball community collectively says that certain behavior crosses a line, that's powerful. If Bird's voice remains isolated, if other legends don't add their support to what he's saying, it's easier for the league to dismiss his concerns as one old-timer's opinion. But if Bird's perspective resonates across the basketball world, if it starts a broader conversation about standards and integrity, then ignoring it becomes much harder for the league. The fascinating part of this situation is that its unfolds response over the next few weeks and months will tell us everything we need to know about whether the league takes competitive integrity seriously. And Caitlin Clark's continued excellence will tell us everything we need to know about the character of the players who are supposed to represent the sport's future. This situation is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. As basketball continues to evolve, moments like this define what Bird is advocating for, or to let the league drift toward a culture where physical intimidation substitutes for basketball excellence. Caitlin Clark's response has been to focus on what she can control: her game, her performance, her development. That approach may ultimately be more powerful than any official penalty. Because her success despite the adversity proves something profound, the best players don't need shortcuts. They don't need to resort to dirty tactics. They win through skill, preparation, and character. The basketball world is watching to see what happens next. And whatever that answer is, it will echo through women's basketball for years to come.